So a type of video I was thinking of making for a while now and haven't actually seen many people do is talk about underrated albums. And when I mean underrated, I don't mean in a sense that they're obscure or like the rarest thing you haven't heard of and more people should check out. I'm talking about albums that people don't hold on high regard, whether it's because of the overall sound of the music or the performances, or maybe it has to do with the person or the content behind certain albums, which people might not be on board with. And it's not like those reasons are not validated, and in no way is this video made as a persuasion to change your mind or like give those albums a second chance. This is not really that much of a recommendation video, it's more of like a hot takes video, and I believe that there are gonna be some spicy ones here, maybe even nuclear some might say. So the way I decided to go with this list is to contain albums in which the general public's reception is not the greatest, and I decided to go with albums which, according to Rate Your Music, are rated below 3 out of 5 stars average, whereas in my case it's albums that I've rated 4 or above. And there's actually quite a lot of hot takes that I have, as it seems, so there are going to be 20 albums that are underrated but I actually ended up liking. So we start at number 20 with a quite disturbing one, being the self-titled Snuff album at 2.71. In the case of some edgy power electronics releases, you might get some positive ratings from a small portion of people, but this wasn't the case with the second Snuff album, which I would really like to recommend because I consider it to be one of the greatest power electronics albums I can think of. However, this is a case of those artists who, let's say, have a history of being problematic. And let me say, this is gonna be a recurring theme. We'll see lots of those down the line. So I mentioned this album in my most well-known video, The Noise Iceberg, mainly because of the packaging in the cassette edition, which was utterly repulsive. Thankfully, the CD version is pretty standard, but even taking the contents of the album itself, this is a really heavy power electronics album about a prostitute that was brutally murdered. The 4 extremely lengthy tracks are just non-stop intensity, getting you into this mentality of torture and extreme levels of discomfort. Especially the final track, Stalker, I consider this to be one of the greatest pieces of power electronics that I've ever heard. Starting with a heavy breathing that follows up with screeching noise feedback and one of the most iconic loops playing over and over again, interrupted in occasions by feedback that also follows a pattern. It's a bit of a challenging release, only recommended to those who are already familiar with the disturbing and misanthropic nature of power electronics and want to dive deep further. At number 19, let's get the most controversial one out of the way, with Peter Sotos's Buyer's Market, with a score of 1.75, which is like pretty understandable and valid, and I get why people would despise this. And this is an album I don't recommend unless you are really in the mood for some depraved shit and want to listen to what is considered one of the most disturbing pieces of media out there. Here's a fun fact about this album. Back when I went to university for sound engineering at the age of 19, we had to make a homework about the producer and 3 of the albums they produced. My edgy ass chose Steve Albini, and the 3 albums I mentioned were In Utero by Nirvana, Surfer Rosa by Pixies, and Buyer's Market by Peter Sotos. I got a 9 out of 10 because it was a well-presented paper. So yeah, this happened back in the day. I want to make abundantly clear that in no way do I endorse anything related to this recording and its making. And if you have no idea what this is about, it's better if it stays that way. And you can't really even consider this an album. This is just an hour of audio recording and interviews by victims of child sexual abuse or parents whose children were victims of abuse. And that's putting it light, since lots of those interviews go to excruciating details. The reason I actually like this album is because this is one of the most effective pieces of media on being an absolute gut-wrenching experience. It is so grim, it's one of the most devastating and harrowing things I've ever listened to. Obviously not for everyone, and totally valid to view this as pure shock value or exploitative. I view this as a documenting piece of awareness for the most depraved and messed up side of humanity, and this album achieves that in a tremendous, raw and unfiltered fashion that will probably leave you scarred. Doing a complete 180 with the most mainstream album on this list, at number 18 is Blurry Face by 21 Pilots, sitting at 2.67. Honestly, I got into this album at first thinking I was gonna dislike it, and ended up being beyond impressed. I'm pretty sure I got the vinyl like the very next day, or at least a few days later, and let me tell you, I love the packaging of this vinyl record, like it's so cool. A very eclectic pop rock album that might have a few cliché aspects that feel kinda cringe, but the overall execution and the amount of so many different ideas and styles blending together felt really impressive, especially the first leg of the album, with some of the main hits being honestly some of my favorite mainstream cuts out of the previous decade. Conceptually and production wise, they really elevated themselves with trends, which is the favorite for lots, and I get that, it's a great album, but Blurry Face was definitely one of the most pleasant surprises for me back in the day. I don't have more to add about this, you are probably already familiar with this album, and if you were never fans of Blurry Face, I totally get it, and at the end of the day, they reached their peak with trends that really helped reevaluate some people's thoughts of their stuff and their overall reputation. At number 17 is Corset with Tower Block Knife Crime at 2.61. Initially, when I made this video, which was one of my first back in the day, and the first shoutout from an artist, I wasn't really anticipating this amount of negativity, to be honest with you. Now, Corset works might be indeed hit or miss, being one of the main names that made lollycore kind of a popular scene at the time, but managing to stay away from it with some legitimately well-crafted and dark breakcore material, where the more meme side of things was still present with a few works here and there. Tower Block Knife Crime was like a left turn with one of the most intense and disturbing works he's ever put out, going into directions of power noise, and some of those frequencies can be indeed pretty harsh. It's a challenging release that while it has a few actual breakcore elements, it mostly goes into a slower tempo, which might have been a turn-off for some people since it doesn't contain the fast-paced energy that Corset is known for. But the lo-fi production and the techniques and equipment being used that becomes the staple for the entirety of this album are valid reasons to not enjoy the album as much. But for me, the way this whole thing sounds, with the insane sidechain compression and all of the painful high frequencies, make this a release that the more I come back to, the more I end up appreciating. And I also can't really think of any other power noise album that sounds similar to this. This is certainly one of a kind experience, and it mainly depends if it's going to click with you or not. At number 16 is the Brian Georgetown Massacre with the album Who Killed Sgt. Pepper at 2.99. One of the lesser known albums from the psychedelic rock band, and also their lowest in rating if you count out a film soundtrack release. This is the ultimate case of a contrarian take, because this is my introduction to the band. I was really impressed with what I heard, and then checking out the rest of their discography, nothing was as intriguing as this. For the most part, it was just average psychedelic rock stuff, but this feels a lot different, like it starts with some sort of trip-hop track, there are various bizarre electronic elements, and the overall sound was just so unique and out there. It seems that this was a big risk, with some really bold choices that seem to not really pay off for the general public, but for me, this is their magnum opus. Nothing else in their catalog, from everything I've heard at least, sounds similar to this. So don't get into this expecting another psychedelic rock album. This is its own bizarre experiment. At number 15 is The Antwoord with Tension at 2.45. One of the main projects that made waves with their wacky, eccentric imagery, the standout video clips, the edgy/cringy personas, and the blend of many different aspects of trashy, tasteless approaches to music. There are so many valid reasons to despise this album, from its profanity to the music to the deliveries, and yet I love it. Obviously, the series of allegations has made all of their stuff to age terribly. It's another case of people with problematic personas actually being problematic in real life. But musically, this is one of those cases of mindless fun with energetic bangers, addictive hooks, and just enough attitude to make a really strong impression. All of the singles of this album are extraordinary in my opinion, and even some deeper cuts like the epic dubstep introduction and the heavily addictive Hey Sexy make for some tracks that I've heard non-stop over the years and not get tired of them. At number 14 is Little Big with Funeral Rave at 2.66. What is, or at least was, considered to be the Russian version of The Antwoord, Little Big also had some very unique and eccentric imagery with some crazy video clips, profanity, edginess, trashy humor, and even trashier music. But here is in a hard bass and rave style. The stuff that has popularized Little Big and the latest singles they put out, which are honestly really underwhelming, hide the fury and insane energy that they had in the era of Funeral Rave. Unlike The Antwoord though, Little Big also had a few serious cuts and a much greater understanding of societal and political issues, which is a plus. But on the other hand, you have addictive tracks like Give Me Your Money or Big Dick, and in general just a really creative album that goes places with stylistical changes to different moods, but for the most part the energy and fun is definitely there. At number 13 is DJ Fresh with Kryptonite at 2.90. The second installment of DJ Fresh, who reached one of his peaks in popularity by being one of the producers of the song Earthquake, which would play everywhere at this time period, DJ Fresh would prove himself to be one of the main up-and-coming forces in the dance floor drum and bass scene, which can certainly be a turn-off since, admittedly, many of the sounds of Kryptonite can be easily considered mainstream and bland. But this album actually has some phenomenal drum and bass tracks, such as Talkbox, which switches melodies 4 times, something you don't get easily in a drum and bass song. Acid Rain is dark and aggressive. Fight might feel like a really generic attempt on Pro Step, but I actually consider this an amazing cut. And then there's the finisher, Heavyweight, a total departure from the rest of the album with some sick bass and a really haunting dark atmosphere. This is another appreciated album in my opinion, which might have its shortcomings, but the highlights over here are beyond astonishing, some of the best stuff DJ Fresh has ever put out. At number 12, we're back with the problematic releases with Chest Flattener by Lollicid. Believe it or not, but there was a period of time where lollicore became a big thing, especially in communities such as 4chan. In search of some of the edgiest shit out there, the first artist that pops up in your head when it comes to lollicore is Gorsit, but thankfully he has gotten past that edgy phase. The other name that is mentioned the most is Lollicid, and in particular this album, which I get it because it's probably one of the best out there. Like for me this album manages to be legitimately disturbing, and while there is a lot of tasteless, degenerate comedic value, at the end of the day it just manages to be absolutely disgusting and repulsive for me, making me wonder why there are people who would be sexually aroused of shit like lollies. And this beat shouldn't go this hard. I don't know how much of this is random or carefully calculated, because some of the bizarre sample loops and beat patterns flow perfectly. Obviously, with this being the most popular release, it's gonna have one of the lowest average negative scores as well, since the majority wouldn't really give a chance to the other Lollicid releases, so they will have a higher average score only for those who know what they're in for. I know that all of this may sound indefensible, but for me, Chest Flattener simply reinforces my disdain towards such a repulsive medium, even if that's not the intent. At number 11 we go back to mainstream with Melanie Martinez and her debut Crybaby at 2.41, another album that has not aged well because of what we know nowadays with Melanie Martinez, and with content and concepts that were certainly more distasteful, especially for an artist with this caliber of popularity. There is a criticism of how this album is portraying cases of child abuse and other sensitive topics without Melanie being the victim herself, to which I'd say that you don't need to experience something in order to talk about it, but sometimes it might feel like a glorification of those issues. But again, this is another case of an album that succeeds on making me feel uncomfortable in a good way. The thing I like most about the album though has to be the instrumentals. The production is incredible, the choruses are super catchy and addictive, and almost every track over here feels like a hit single, which is a really rare case to get this amount of consistency in a pop album. Even some of my favorite pop artists that have some of the best pop singles I've heard have not managed to make an album that feels this complete from start to finish. And I think if it wasn't for the abhorrent lyrical content, a statement that I can agree with, I believe that more people would appreciate what this album manages to do with its music, something that in my opinion was a massive downgrade with the next two albums. At number 10 is White House with Dedicated to Peter Curtin, Sadist and Mass Slayer at 2.86. If we count out Birdseed, this would be my contender for the best White House album. Out of this first era where their works would focus on serial killers, this one is the most chilling sonically. The fact that this was made in 1981 is mind-blowing to me. The screeching microphone feedback is very intense. The water splash sounds that make their appearance on lots of the tracks over here just add to the unsettling nature of this project. It's not all that easy to get into, and it's mostly recommended to those who are already familiar with the early works of White House, and it's by far their biggest standout out of the early 80s works in my opinion, alongside the crazy collaboration with Steven Stapleton. At number 9 is going to be Deadmau5 with the album 4x4 equals 12 at 2.86. Kind of surprised how underappreciated Deadmau5 is. But then again, Read Your Music is not a site where you would find that much positivity towards EDM and other forms of dance music. Many electronic releases fall under the radar on this site, and although this is not the case for Deadmau5, the approach on this album with a few attempts at dubstep that are considered piss poor, or soft rap deliveries on 2 tracks, are possible contributors to the somewhat more negative reception of this album. I still consider this to be Deadmau5's best work, with Random Album Title being a close second, and one of the most consistently great dance albums I can think of, keeping its energy with lots of innovative ideas from start to finish. At number 8 is the split of Evanescence Snares and Stunt Rock with Fuck Canada, Fuck America at 2.61. One of the first releases from both of those artists' catalogs also contains some of the wackiest experimentations, which says a lot, but the overall sound and sampling of this project is so grating and so appalling that I can see why this has never been released outside of the CDR version back in 1999, and how this can be too much even for veterans of breakcore. It's a very lo-fi sounding release with a ton of distorted beats, mixing that is all over the place, and it can be really rough at times, especially the stunt rock side, which sounds so amateurish. Some beats and samples aren't even looped properly at times, and it makes me wonder how much of this was intentional or just random elements being thrown together. But this roughness is part of the appeal of this project for me. The Evanescence Snare side for me contains some of the most mind-blowing structures, pacing, switch-ups out of everything he has done, and some of the most questionable sample choices. But the stunt rock side is beyond offensive and repulsive, like it's so unsettling and disgusting, and the music sounding so amateurish simply elevates those feelings. It feels like you've stumbled upon a dark web CD that was never meant to be published, budget insane release, and it's pretty understandable why people wouldn't be on board with this, like this can be too much, both musically and contextually. At number 7 is Moby with All Visible Objects at 2.70. Another artist whose works are not really appreciated enough or at your music. Outside of play, no one even seems to give a chance at anything Moby puts out, especially the later stuff. And sure, his catalog is definitely hit or miss, and all over the place. But to me, All Visible Objects is possibly the greatest successor to his early electronic dance era, with some of the most gorgeous tracks he's ever put out. The very unexpected and bombastic power is taken, and in my opinion, this album contains some of the greatest stuff he's ever put out. It's a spectacular house album that has the emotional impact, the atmosphere and the progression that has made his works so distinct and powerful over the years. It has grown a lot on me over time and has become one of the most stunning electronic releases I can think of in recent memory. At number 6 is Merzbow with Lowest Music 2 at 2.49. Obviously, a really small amount of people have rated this in order to have a clear idea how lots of Merzbow fans would actually feel about this, but it gives me a chance to mention this album once again anyways. I still cannot stress enough how amazed I am by the very bizarre nature of this album, which only consists of tape loops, and that's about it. The bold experimentation in display may only come off as just Merzbow messing around, and just an art piece that consists of random sounds that feels like a waste of time. However, I can't think of those loops being done more perfectly. The question on whether all of this was intentional or just randomness is what really appeals to me in this particular project. I think that the tape loops era is the most underlooked from Merzbow, containing some of the most creative works you can find in the underground experimental scene. At number 5 is Burzum with Doddy Balders at 2.61. Here is possibly the hottest take that you are going to listen from me, but I consider Doddy Balders to be the best Burzum album, and I don't mean out of the Dungeon Synth era, I mean in general. This is for me the best Burzum album, and it might be my most played album over the years. The fact that he was able to make this while in jail is insane to me. But even if the next album, Hills or Scuff, is considered a more well put together work, it's the simplicity and roughness that makes this work so effective to me. Like, there have been so many times where I would chill with my friends at the park and this album would play in its entirety in the background at least once. It's a case of simple but effective, and for me Doddy Balders is one of the greatest examples of that. It's the album that got me into Dungeon Synth and minimal music in general, but I've yet to find anything else that surpasses this. This album is simply unmatched for me. At number 4 is Mindless Self-Indulgence with If at 2.91. Another case of a group whose lyrical content has aged horribly after the allegations, which was disappointing in the sense that to me, Mindless Self-Indulgence's attitude and lyrical content felt more like ironic, as if it was poking fun on degenerate cultures and all the sex scandals with emo adolescents in the 2000s. While If kinda tones it down with the profanity, since we don't have the N-word or the F-slur over here. Same with their last album. It seems that they also toned it down musically as well, and so at the end of the day, fans of their previous works seem to have been left with a tasteless synth-punk album that lacks the energy and ferocity of what has made their previous work stand out. And while I can agree to a certain extent, it still contains some awesome energetic tracks, catchy hooks and melodies, and in general another mindless fun album. While a bit more simplistic in its ideas, it doesn't take away from the experience, as the album still delivers with one of the most consistently solid works that they've ever put out. At number 3 is Bring Me the Horizon with Music to Listen to, etc. etc. at 2.59. Technically it's an EP, but it's like 75 minutes long, so I decided to put it on the list anyway. Ever since I mentioned this once with my top EPs of the past decade, it was still a pretty fresh release, and now that it has grown on me, It's insane to think that this is actually one of my favorite electronic albums in recent memory, and it comes from Bring Me the Horizon of all bands, which I've never been a fan of with their past works prior to this. Maybe this might not sound like a hot take that I consider this my favorite Bring Me the Horizon project, because I'm more into this chill electronic vibe rather than what they were known for with metalcore. But I really believe that fans of electronic music should not let this one slide off the radar just because of the name. I didn't get into it expecting anything special at all, and I was beyond surprised with it. It does have some bold and bizarre choices to it, like the almost 20-minute loop on the track Underground Pig, but this massive album has so many different elements to it, like chill down tempo and future garage, to the epic classical and devastating liberation, to industrial and glitch and house. This is a very special release that really surprised me how it's basically treated as throwaways, because to me this is Bring Me the Horizon at their peak. At number 2 is Roscoe with OMG at 2.43. Talking about electronic dance releases being underappreciated on this website, Roscoe's debut is possibly the greatest example of dubstep you can find in a full-on cohesive album with no misses. With a vast array of features going to other avenues of dance music such as house, old school breakbeats, electro hop, and even actual dub, just like with the roots of dubstep. Being less chaotic and over the top from what Skrillex popularized, Roscoe tones it down with a more straightforward approach and tons of mesmerizing cuts that can easily get stuck in your head. This album has for me some of the best drops and build-ups these styles have to offer, and it's really enjoyable. And finally at number 1, with the most underrated album I can think of, is The Prodigy with Always Outnumbered, Never Outgunned at 2.98. Following up the success of The Fat of the Land is a difficult task, and this album 7 years later is certainly not what people anticipated. It seems that this album is also not appreciated by the group itself, since I've seen them twice now, and in both sets they didn't play a single song out of Always Outnumbered, Never Outgunned. This album is to a slower tempo, but somehow more aggressive, more bold in its execution. It feels like a risky album to make, which does seem like a product of its time, since this album screams of 2000s with its trashy aesthetic and the rise of electroclash, and yet I cannot think of any other album that sounds similar to this. After all of these years, I've yet to experience anything that comes close to what this album did. An album that I've seen no one being able to recreate, not even Prodigy themselves. So while this departure didn't seem to pay off for the general public, to me this is one of the most unique and refreshing albums that I can think of. It took me a while to really get into everything that this album has to offer, because it's a lot. But this has definitely been one of the albums I resonate with the most and has influenced me a lot as an artist. It's a mystery to me how this album is not in the same level of appraisal with The Fat of the Land, but this is not the world we live in. And those are 20 underrated albums that I personally like. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.